So what was the doctrine established in the case of Neer versus Minnesota? No prior restraint, right? That means what? You can't stop someone from saying something or publishing something before they've done it. If they do it and it's a bad thing or is against the law somehow, then you can punish them afterwards, but you can't stop them from doing it ahead of time. So the New York Times versus the United States case was just the same idea. This is the Pentagon Papers, are a series of classified documents being released, like illegally, from the State Department, and they give them to the New York Times. And the New York Times begins to publish them in like installments. Every day they publish a little bit at a time. And the documents are old. Like it's the title of the official title is like the history of the involvement of the United States in Vietnam or something like that. And it's about from like Eisenhower through Johnson. How was the U.S. like? What do we do in Vietnam? And the answer was that we did a whole lot more than we told the American people we did. And so as the New York Times publishes these papers, people are getting angry at the government. So Nixon's president at the time. It does not have anything to do with Nixon. He's not mentioned in the documents because they're all historical documents. But he feels angry that like the trust has been violated. I don't know. He's mad. And so he gets the court to file an injunction to stop the New York Times from publishing any more of the Pentagon Papers. And the New York Times sues and says, you can't do that to us. Like, that's not fair. And so it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that based on the doctrine of no prior restraint, that the New York Times is right. They have to be allowed to publish whatever they want to publish. Now, if the New York Times publishes something that then is proven to be illegal, like it's illegal to publish classified information that endangers U.S. troops, like in the present tense. So if you publish like the location of a U.S. battalion or something like that, then you can get in trouble for that. But otherwise, they have to be allowed to go ahead and publish. So the doctrine of no prior restraint. This is just some exceptions, some other things that like when can they stop you from saying something before you say it? Usually the answer is national security. So again, if it's in the middle of an active war and we're publishing information about that war, then you can get in trouble for that. It's part of how the government tried to stop the publication, like newspapers from publishing some of the WikiLeaks documents that like named U.S. like operatives overseas and stuff. Although most of them lost their cases because the Supreme Court was like, well, it's already on the internet. Like, what, how much more harm can it do for the newspaper to publish it? Like, everyone knows it's there or whatever. And so then Schenck versus the United States, this one has to do with a socialist guy who is trying to hold this rally to encourage people to resist the draft and like get rid, overthrow our like totalitarian government or whatever. And the Supreme Court rules that he can be stopped from doing that. And the reason it's important, that doesn't sound very important, but the reason it's important is because the court, it's in Schenck versus United States, that the court establishes the clear and present danger test. The clear and present danger test. And that's basically like, everyone knows you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And that example comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes explaining the clear and present danger test. It's the idea that any kind of speech that you might make that is going to put the country or your community in a clear and present danger is not allowed. So you can't be protected as free expression. So Schenck versus United States, the clear and present danger test. There we go. Okay, but so there are some exceptions. So I'm going to put a pause on that for a second because it's kind of entertaining to read. So I'd rather you listen to me for a second before we get there. So remember, can the government discriminate against you? Can it treat you differently on the basis of your race or your gender or whatever? Can it do that? Yes, but it can't just do it whenever it wants to. It has to do what? Have some kind of reason, right? Either just a regular reason or an important reason or a compelling government interest depending upon what it is that they want to discriminate against you on the basis of, right? So we can do it, we just have to have a really good reason. In the same way, you have right to free expression, but sometimes the government's rights or responsibilities become more important than your own. And that's the idea behind the clear and present danger test, right? Like you have a right to free expression, but at some point the government's like need or right or responsibility to protect people is more important than your right to free expression, and therefore you can be stopped. What I'm trying to say here, or the lead-in I'm trying to make, has to do with the school system. So the rights that we have aren't quite the same when you're in the public school system. And the courts have basically explained that by using this idea that the states have a really significant responsibility to promote public education. It's important for our society that kids, are literate and understand, social expectations and have a foundation in basic like information, like all this stuff is a really important job of the state. And so because that job is so important, that there are some times where the schools can infringe upon what you might otherwise believe are your rights in order to accomplish its goal. But that doesn't mean that you have no rights here. This is kind of out of order. We're going to get to Tinker versus Des Moines in a second. But in the Tinker versus Des Moines case, one of the most important things they said is that you do not lose your rights at the schoolhouse gate, meaning that just because you're in school doesn't mean that you have no more rights. But your rights are limited, and we're going to talk about some of those limitations. So Bethel versus Frazier is a good example. Now, I can't say this out loud in class because of obvious reasons, but I strongly encourage you to go and look up this case when you are not in my classroom because it is highly entertaining. So what happens is, it's the best part. It's kind of like when Nate gets into trouble, but he's gotten into trouble in such an interesting and entertaining way that I'm kind of impressed at his ability to do that I'm almost not mad. It's just kind of how I feel about this case. So it was a surprise assembly. The students didn't know it was going to happen. So he was not prepared for this ahead of time. He didn't plan this out ahead of time. But all of a sudden the students are called into an assembly and they're told that they're going to nominate for class officers. So anyone who wants to make a nomination, they can raise it. They can go up and give a little speech and nominate their friends for class officer. And then at the end, after all the speeches, they'll just vote. So he stands up and he nominates his best friend. And he does so in a speech full of innuendo. That's the best I've got. I think I practiced for a long time before I figured out how to write that. In a speech that is so full of innuendo that I can't tell you it is really impressive. If you are completely innocent and have no idea what any of that stuff means, then it's a perfectly normal speech nominating a friend to be a class officer with all kinds of good reasons. But then, the fact is that we do know what he's talking about, and it's really kind of horrific, but also kind of impressive. Anyway, so he gets yanked off the stage, and he's suspended, and all this business. He goes, that's my right to free expression. You can't stop me, whatever. I didn't say any bad words. I didn't, do any rude gestures. You can't stop me from whatever. And the Supreme Court basically says, haha, yes, they can. But the decision was kind of entertaining. The Chief Justice who wrote the majority opinion, how did he phrase it? Something like a speech full of sexual reference is likely to excite and upset a group of young people who are as yet unfamiliar with the effects of their hormones or something. It was this really long-winded way of explaining teenagers can't handle this kind of thing. And so he was, he gets suspended for a while, and that's Bethel versus Frazier. Then Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer, this has to do with the student press. So it's a student newspaper, and their very last edition of the school year, they're publishing 2 articles. One of them is about teen pregnancy, and they interviewed some students who had children or were pregnant at the time. And then one's about divorce, and they, again, interviewed some students whose parents were divorced. And I don't remember if they changed the names, but left too much identifying information, or maybe they didn't change the names, whatever it is. The principal reads this advance issue. So they've already gone to press, they've already started the process, but they bring the edition for the principal to sign off on before they give it out. And the principal says you can't publish this. For whatever reason, either they used their regular names, or they had too much identifying information. People could find out who these kids are that were interviewed, and you didn't get their parents' permission to talk about their lives. That's their parents' private lives they've been talking about. And then he was worried that the teen pregnancy article might encourage or glorify teen pregnancy or whatever. And so then there wasn't enough time to go back and fix it, to take out the articles or whatever. They just had to throw it out. So they the students felt all their work had gone to waste. They'd been censored, and so they protest. They go all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that, in fact, the school does have a right to censor, essentially, the content of any school newspaper because it has the school's name on it, and it is funded by the school, and therefore the school will be held liable by the community for the content of that paper, and so the school has a right to decide what it is. And then later cases have gone before the court, they were independent student newspapers, they were completely self-funded, they worked in their own time, they just distributed the paper at school, and those were also found to be legitimately under the authority of the principal, because even if the school doesn't officially fund them, if anyone who reasonably pick up the paper would assume that the school supported it because it was given out at school, therefore the school had a right to control the content of the paper. So again, it has to do with the school's control or reputation or whatever. And then, of course, there's I didn't tell this one, this was kind of entertaining. So in 2007, this is a school in Alaska. And the like Olympic torch relay was going on, where they bring the torch from like all over the world or whatever. And the Olympic torch was going to pass right in front of their high school. So they let out school, like not forever, just like temporarily. Like everyone go outside, go see the torch run by, make history, whatever. And then we'll come back for the rest of the day. And so they go out, and this one kid, he ends up, or he deliberately goes to the other side of the street. So he's not on school property anymore. He's just right across the street from the high school. And so he waits until the cameras are all there and the torch is coming past, and he unrolls this big banner that says "Bong hits for Jesus." And the principal runs over, like, hey, you giggle, like someone would do that, wouldn't they? The principal runs over and snatches it out of his hands, and then punishes him, like he gets suspended or something. And he protests, saying that it was his right to free expression and he wasn't on school property anyway, and blah blah blah. And the Supreme Court said, like, haha. But no, you can still be punished because this was a school-sponsored function, and like you were under the control of the school, and just no, you can't do it. And so there you go. Right. Okay, and then there's Tinker versus Des Moines, which is like the biggest landmark case. So this is 1969, and what you want to write down for sure is that it establishes the right of symbolic speech. Tinker versus Des Moines establishes the right of symbolic speech. Establishes the right of symbolic speech. And so you probably remember the story from U.S. history. There's these kids, and they want to wear a black armband to school to protest the Vietnam War, and they're told ahead of time, if you do this, you'll be suspended. So they show up with their black armbands on, and they're suspended. And then they protest, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. I do want to kind of give you some more of the gray here. So the black and white part is, what does the Supreme Court say? Did they have the right to wear the armbands? Yes, right. It's protected right of free speech because even though they weren't saying anything, the black armband was a form of symbolic speech. They were trying to send a message. But there is more gray. So here's the thing. The court goes to great pains to explain that the idea of symbolic speech and like the fact that they're going to say that in this case the students had a right to go to school with their armbands on does not mean that the school can't regulate what you wear or other forms of behavior in school. The problem the Supreme Court said was that the school didn't have sufficient evidence that wearing the black armbands was going to be a problem. The school says we don't want them to wear the armbands because we think it'll cause conflict in the school. We think it'll distract from the school day. It'll be about the message. But there was no real evidence that that would happen, right? There wasn't like some group of students who had said they were going to protest if they saw the kids with black armbands or like threats against the kids. Like none of that was true. None of that had materialized. So the Supreme Court made it clear that if they had worn the black armband and somehow been distracting, like been bothering their peers about it or making all kinds of speeches about it or getting in the way of classroom without it or getting, into trouble about it, like then the school would have every right to tell them you can't wear your armbands anymore. But the reason that the students had to be allowed either to wear the armbands or not, they had their suspensions revoked, was because there wasn't sufficient evidence to show that the school had a reason to do that. So sometimes students hear the case and like, that means they can't dress code us, like free expression and self whatever. But lots of things. The first of which, you can't tell me that like your desire to wear short shorts is like a way to express an opinion about something. So no. And then so they're not a form of symbolic speech. And then like secondarily, like if the court or if the school can articulate a significant enough reason for like why they want to ban a particular thing, then the courts have been fairly lenient about that. So anyway, this was again a kind of special case because it was a particular political thing they were trying to say. Like self-expression and like my personality is less compelling for the government to give you a right as opposed to like here's a message I'm trying to send about an important political question. So there's that. Okay, 1989 Texas versus Johnson. This had to do with flag burning. Anybody surprised or a little bit ashamed of how many of these cases involve Texas? It's a big state. Anyway, so Texas versus Johnson involves this guy. He's mad at like U.S. Middle East policy, and he goes to this courthouse, and which I feel like is a poor choice of place to whatever. Anyway, he goes before this courthouse and he burns an American flag. And Texas, like every other state in the United States, had a law against burning flags, so he's arrested. And he like protests, saying it's a right to free expression. The Supreme Court agrees that flag burning is included in your right to symbolic speech. Obviously, you're trying to send a message by burning a flag, so there's that. This is like an interesting just little side case. In 2006, this like middle school teacher burned a flag in class, like in a trash can or something, and then he told the students to go home and write a paper about how it made them feel to watch the American flag burn. and he was reassigned to non-teaching duties. And the reason that was given was because he had violated fire safety rules. Not safe.
Yeah, if he's asking them to write a paper about it and like how this makes them feel and it's like a political message, it's probably not like a science class.
Well, anyway, and the court declined to hear the case and like let the lower court's ruling stand, which like had thrown out the case and was like, you didn't. They articulated a reason why you were not, and you weren't fired anyway. Like, get over it. But also, why? Anyway, but so right after the Texas versus Johnson case, there began a movement that continues till today. Every single congressional session since then, they have proposed a constitutional amendment to ban flag burning. Hasn't yet happened. I don't really think it's going to happen. I don't really think it should happen, but there we go. So, okay. Just a couple of like other side notes. The court has ruled that burning a draft card is not protected speech. You can tell me it's a statement all day long, and sure it is, but your draft card is an important like part of the way the government carries out a like legitimate government function, which is like organizing the military, and so that's not okay. And then this one's kind of hard to explain. So you can't have a law that punishes racially discriminatory speech. So it was a law in this community, I think in Florida, but I don't really remember, that like banned like speech racially discriminatory speech, whatever. So it was targeted at the KKK. So if the KKK had like made this sign that said like all black people are stupid and should go back to Africa and they should all die or whatever, like that would be prosecutable. But if you wrote all KKK members are stupid and should go back to the Middle Ages and all KKK members should die or whatever, like that wouldn't be prosecutable. Does that make sense? So it was really targeted at speech that directly opposed, that was discriminatory, that was against a racial group. So if you had called all white people or all KKK members the exact same words, it would not have been punishable. Does that make sense? So the law specifically targeted the content of the speech. That's the legal precedent you need to know, is that any laws that focus on the content of the speech, I mean, they look at the words you're saying or the words you're using and make that right or wrong or punishable or not, those laws are usually going to get thrown out. So I can regulate when you can speak or how you can speak. I can sometimes regulate whether or not you can speak. But if all I'm regulating is specifically what it is you're saying, then usually those are going to get thrown out, right? Because it's not fair. We can't say that one person's allowed to say hateful words, but the other person isn't because they're discriminating against a racial minority or something. So there's that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about speech that is not protected. So these are things that are not covered by the First Amendment and can be regulated. So first, there's fighting words. Fighting words are not protected. So if I, come up to Brooke here and I'm like yelling at her face and calling her all kinds of ugly things and just whatever, abusing her in general, and then she like takes a swing at me, I can be punished for that, right? I mean, she could also be punished for like hitting me, but I can be held liable for my speech, which caused that problem. Another case that we used to teach the AP government students, but I've taken off the list, but it's called Brandenburg versus Ohio. Had to do with this KKK guy. It's always the KKK. God, KKK. Anyway, so this KKK guy, he's like giving this big speech outside of this like mostly Jewish neighborhood, and he's talking about like get those Jews out of this town. They don't belong here, and we want to like send them back to where they came from, and like make this town like good again, whatever. So he gives this big like speech, they all wave their pitchforks and rah-rah or whatever, and then like everybody goes home. He goes home, like whatever. And then like the next day or 2 days later, I can't remember now exactly, a group of people who had been at the rally, they do go into this Jewish neighborhood and they like vandalize a bunch of stores and they break windows in a couple of homes. And so then the city tries to prosecute him, like the guy who gave the speech, and say like you shouldn't, like you're responsible for this thing that's happening. And the Supreme Court creates this imminent lawless action test, which basically says that you can be prosecuted for your speech if it incites imminent lawless action. Imminent meaning right now, lawless meaning illegal, action meaning a thing that happens, right? So in this case, they held that he could not be prosecuted because did his speech cite lawless action? Maybe, but was it imminent lawless action? No, it was the next day or a couple of days later. Like that was too far removed. Now, if he gives the rah-rah speech and then immediately a whole bunch of people run into the streets and go and like vandalize houses, is that going to count? Yeah, then he can be prosecuted because he clearly like egged them on and like encouraged that to happen. This is interesting because it's actually before the same questions before the courts right now against President Trump. So during the election season, like during the campaign, President Trump was at a rally or had a rally, and there were some protesters there, and they were thrown out. And while they're being thrown out, like by security, Trump from the podium says, like, "Get him out of here, throw him out." Like, yeah, get him out or whatever. He's like kind of hollering about this whole thing. And the protesters are kind of roughed up. Like a couple of them get punched, and one of them has a rib broken. And anyway, they were like, the crowd was pretty rough on them as they were trying to leave or being pushed out to leave. And so they're suing President Trump, well, I mean, candidate Trump then, but now President Trump, saying that like he was responsible for the violence that they received because he was like egging the crowds on. I don't know how I think the court's going to rule, but in any case, that's the question. Like, did his words incite imminent lawless action, or was it unrelated? Like, did his words, like, he didn't mean to make them hurt them, he just wanted them to leave, and that's kind of going before the court now. So, okay, slander and libel are not protected, so I can't just say whatever I want to if it's false. So they both mean the same kind of thing. Slander is spoken, S for spoken, and then libel is printed. So slander and libel, S for spoken slander, and then libel is printed. And it means when you either speak or print something that is knowingly, that you know is false about a person or an organization to try to defame them or hurt their reputation. So for example, if I were to start spreading rumors about Miss Elder, I don't know, making up some kind of horrible thing that she's done or something she said, that, like I say, she said something she didn't say, and I get all of you mad, and you tell your parents, and they get mad, and they all call for the administration to fire her, and she gets fired or whatever, like, she can sue me for that. Because if I knew it was false when I said it to you, then I have committed slander. The press then is responsible for libel. So if the press knowingly publishes false information about a person intended to hurt their reputation, then the press can also be prosecuted for libel. So that's illegal. You can't do that. Public figures, interestingly, have kind of a higher threshold. So like, let's say that I was Beyonce. Lots of people are talking about Beyonce, right? So if some sort of tabloid magazine, somebody comes up to them and says, "Hey, so I'm friends with Beyonce, and I can't tell you this, but you can print without my name that this and this happened. I make up some story." Well, Beyonce would have to prove that that tabloid knew that the information was false before they published it. If they didn't know it was false, then they can't be prosecuted for libel because she's a public figure. So like, the court basically says that you should expect people to talk about you if you're famous. And so you can't expect that the newspapers would like have to verify unverifiable information. How do you verify like whether or not I named my cat Mittens or something? Like, you can't, right? Unless you like are in my home. And so anyway, that's the idea. Okay, and then obscenity is not protected. So like on television, they can't say bad words, or they can't have like nudity on like public television, whatever. And that's regulated. But so obscenity had to be defined, and the case is Miller versus California. So obscenity is defined in Miller versus California, and there's like 3 pieces, and I hope that you recognize that 2 of the 3 are very gray. Like, what does that mean exactly? So first, for something to be considered obscene, it has to be seen like by the average person as like lewd. So just because one person is offended or one really conservative group is offended, that doesn't count as obscenity. It has to be seen as lewd by the average person. So this also means that this standard changes over time, right? In the 1950s, it was seen as obscene for Lucy and her husband to be sleeping in the same bed together. So they had separate beds. And I Love Lucy, which I just thought was always entertaining. These days, I wish we had the problem of separate beds for people on television. Anyway, good thing my kids only watch the iPad and PBS Kids. Okay, then the next part, this is the one that's very black and white. It's really clear. So the only things that we're going to count under obscenity laws are speech or images that describe or depict offensively sexual conduct or excretory functions. Sexual conduct or excretory functions. So pooping and peeing and doing the you-know-what, those things are off limits, generally speaking. But otherwise, we're going to be fine. So I don't know how you could make, like...
Are you saying that it's not considered offensive?
Well, so like your textbook, your health textbook that might like depict excretory functions is not going to be considered obscene. Because that's probably not done in an offensive way if it's like clinical. I don't know. Oh yeah, so this is down here. And so then finally, the last part of like the obscenity is that for it to be considered obscene, it has to lack like social, scientific, or not scientific, social, literary, artistic value, what it has to be, it can't be valuable in any way. So this is another gray area because who gets to decide what counts as art? You know? Who gets to decide? And so this means that a lot of things that get sort of like that violate anti-obscenity laws often go to court for a judge to decide if it meets these pieces of the test. So anyway, okay, a few more things that the government can regulate. This is mostly a reminder when we learn from the bureaucracy. So the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, they can regulate advertising. So that's the truth in advertising laws. They can't like that's why your Cheerios box no longer says Cheerios is proven to lower your risk of heart disease. No, it's not. They have to say like a diet rich in fiber has been linked in scientific studies to the lowering of one's risk for heart disease and whatever. So, those are rules. They can control what they can say in advertisements. The FCC regulates the radio and the TV airwaves. So again, only the airwaves. Like cable is something different. They don't face nearly as many regulations because you like choose to do that. But if anyone is like freely available to access this information, so that's why they can't say bad words like on the morning show, and they have to follow different standards. So that's why there's differences between like TV shows on HBO and TV shows on NBC. Like they have very different content. Anyway, and then the FEC, of course, regulates electioneering activities. So can you guys remember the name of the Supreme Court case that dealt with an FEC regulation on electioneering communication? Citizens United versus the FEC, right? So the FEC used to say you couldn't put electioneering communication out 60 days before the election, but the Supreme Court overruled that. But anyway, generally speaking, they can be regulated. We're going to skip that one. Okay, next let's do the Second Amendment. What's the Second Amendment all about? The right to bear arms, that's right. So the next two cases, McDonald versus the City of Chicago and DC versus Heller, are both about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. They're both essentially the same thing. Like in the what was it about box, I don't know which box that is, you can just like write them together. Because both of them involve the city banning the use of handguns. So you couldn't have a handgun in the city. Bans the use of handguns. And the outcome for both of them is the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. The Second Amendment says that you can't do that. You have to allow people to have handguns if they want to have handguns. You can regulate them. You can require them to be licensed or registered or blah, blah, blah. But you can't ban them altogether. So why are there two of them on this case? And why do I want you to know McDonald's versus City of Chicago instead of DC versus Heller? Think. DC versus Heller happened first, by the way. And then a couple of years later was McDonald versus City of Chicago. So why do you have to know the McDonald case and not the DC versus Heller case? Why do I care about that? You're right. Why do I care about that? So what about that? So did DC versus Heller incorporate the Second Amendment? No, because DC is not a state. It's part of the federal government anyway. The Bill of Rights always applied to DC versus Heller. So when it was DC versus Heller, all this was about was clarifying what the Second Amendment would or would not allow. Yeah? But in McDonald versus City of Chicago, now we're applying the Bill of Rights Second Amendment to a state. This is the state that wants to ban this particular kind of handgun. And the Supreme Court ruled in that case, no, the Second Amendment applies to you too. We are selectively incorporating this to you, and that's how that went. So there we go. Okay, now we're going to move on to the right to privacy. Where's my list of cases? I'll just look off of somebody else's. So privacy is going to be Griswold, Roe v. Wade, and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Those three all together. So Griswold, Roe v. Wade, and Planned Parenthood versus Casey is all the right to privacy. Now, what are you going to put for your amendment? Which amendments do we find the right to privacy? Good answer. It's not there. But where do they find it? If it's not there word for word, nowhere does it say you have the right to privacy. What does it say that kind of gives you that right? Okay, the Fourth Amendment, they can't search your house without a reason, so that kind of suggests that you should be able to not have to have your stuff seen all the time. The Ninth Amendment, we have these other rights that aren't listed. The Fifth Amendment, your stuff can't be taken away without your due process. You have the right not to self-incriminate. There are certain thoughts you're allowed to keep private to yourself that you can't be forced to say out loud. And then there's one more. The third, right? The government can't send soldiers into your home just because in times of peace. So the word that you want to know is penumbra. So like for that which amendment box, I want you to write penumbras of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 9th Amendments. Penumbras of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 9th Amendments. Penumbras of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 9th Amendments. So penumbra is a fancy Latin word that I assume means shadows. I've been told I don't speak Latin, so I have no idea. It means shadows. And the idea is that it doesn't say it like outright, they have the right to privacy. But the court ruled in Griswold versus Connecticut that there are these penumbras of the right to privacy within these different amendments. So the Griswold case involves the idea of contraception. At that time in Connecticut, as well as in most states, it was illegal for a doctor to share any information about contraception. So the pill itself, but also barrier contraception methods. All that was considered to be obscene. Like you shouldn't be talking about your you-know-what with your you-know-who, I don't know. Anyway. So the lawsuit was brought before the Supreme Court, and they ruled that based on these penumbras of a right to privacy, that a married woman had a right to talk with her doctor about any of those topics. It's important to note that this first case really only applied to married women. The Supreme Court still held that, like, well, you can consider it obscene to talk about, like, sexual stuff with unmarried women because we would assume maybe that they wouldn't need to know. I don't know. I give up. But eventually, well, fairly quickly, within the next 5 years, other cases came that challenged the limitation to unmarried women, and obviously it was very quickly opened to all women. So this is the right to privacy dealing with information about contraception. This was under which Supreme Court justice? 1965? Earl Warren, right? So this is Earl Warren, who basically establishes the right to privacy via those penumbras of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 9th Amendments, okay? But then in 1973, we have a new court justice. Yeah, Warren Burger, and they get a case now about abortion. This is another Texas case. Norma McCorvey was a woman who was pregnant with her 2nd or 3rd child, I can't remember now, and she wants an abortion, but she's too poor. It's illegal in Texas to get an abortion, as it is in most places, and she's too poor to go to New Mexico or wherever it was. It was the closest place that allowed abortions. And so she sues and says that Texas has violated her right to privacy, that she should be able to get this medical procedure, and it goes to the Supreme Court. Now, what I want you to add under the which part of the Constitution part here is the idea of substantive due process. The idea of substantive due process. Substantive due process. Now, you might remember from our Washington versus Trump case, we talked about procedural due process. What's procedural due process? Like?
You can't just randomly do it. There has to be a process to it.
Yeah, so if I want to take away your liberty and put you in jail, there's a series of steps I have to go through. First, I have to get an arrest warrant, and then I have to have a search warrant to gather evidence, and then I have to book you and have to provide you with a lawyer and make sure that you have adequate resources for your defense, and I have to make sure that whatever the jury is chosen legally, and I have to, anyway, there's all kinds of steps I have to follow before I can legally take away your liberty, right? That's procedural due process. Substantive due process is, fair warning, kind of confusing because I think it's a contradiction in terms. So substantive due process was actually first created by the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. And the idea is that there are certain rights that are so substantive, so inherent to like your humanity or your citizenship, that there is actually no process by which they can be taken away. So the Dred Scott decision, you remember that one? The guy, the slave who had been taken by his master into the north and then was taken back to the south by his master, and then eventually he says, I should be free because I was in the free states. In that case, what the Supreme Court said, Roger B. Taney, the Supreme Court Justice at the time, Chief Justice, said that the right to own property in slaves was so inherent to what it meant to be an American that there was no way, no process by which a state could deny you your right to own your slave as property. So that, like, even if there was a democratic election where everybody voted and decided they wanted to be a free state, that was still illegal. That there was no way, no process by which we could deny someone their right to own property in slaves. So fast forwarding to Roe v. Wade, in this case, the Supreme Court decided, based on beginning with the doctrine of privacy, but then they decided that the right to control the medical procedures that you and your own person undergo is so substantive or so inherent to your right as a person that there is no process by which they can be removed. So like a woman's right to be able to control her own body and decide what she wants to happen to her body is so substantive to who she is as a human being that there's no process that we can use to remove them. So it gets kind of contradiction in terms, right? It's not really due process because it's not about a process. It's like there is no process. But anyway, it's called substantive due process. So, but even then, it's kind of a contradiction because the Roe v. Wade decision has 3 parts, right? So the first part, so the Supreme Court was it was a hard case to decide. It is a hard case to talk about. Like, it's very controversial to think about abortion. And so the Supreme Court ends up with this, like, 3-part plan, which includes trimesters. Those of you who have not been pregnant, trimesters are the 3, like, thirds of the pregnancy. So, like, the first couple of months and then the second and so on. Anyway, so in the first trimester, the Supreme Court finds, basically, they stay true to the idea of substantive due process. In the first trimester, there is nothing that the state can do to limit a woman's access to abortion. Nothing. That women must have unfettered access, absolutely no limitations on their ability to get abortion in the first trimester. In the second trimester, because abortion procedures become a bit more risky in the second trimester, and because there begin to be some kind of complicated questions about whether or not the fetus is a baby or life or a thing or whatever, then in the second trimester, the states can regulate abortion. They can't ban it, but they can regulate it, maybe saying that certain procedures aren't allowed or like regulating how the abortion has to be carried out or where or whatever. They can regulate it, but they cannot ban it, and they can only regulate it for the sake of the mother's health. That's all. The second trimester, they can regulate it for the sake of the mother's health. Then in the third trimester, so the last part of the pregnancy, then the states, they may, if they want to, outright ban abortions, but only if they include an exception for the life of the mother. They have to still allow abortions if a woman's life is at stake, or she to try to deliver. So in the first trimester, what? Nothing at all. In the second trimester, he's next door. Yes. In the second trimester, you can regulate it, not ban it, and only for the health of the mother. And then in the third trimester, yeah, banning is okay as long as you have clause for health. That's because in the third trimester, the viability of the fetus or the baby has been better established, and therefore, like, the states can reasonably say that they have a right to protect the life of the baby as well as the mother. That's third trimester. So I think that's controversial or complicated because if they say it's substantive due process, either woman has an absolute right or not. But instead we have 3-part rights. I don't know. Anyway, okay. That's of that. Then in 1992, so in the intervening 20 years, many states that oppose abortion try to figure out a way around it, and they begin to pass a whole bunch of regulations, like that if a woman wants an abortion, she has to be shown a sonogram of her baby or her fetus. She has to look at the sonogram and have all the parts described to her before she can approve an abortion. Or a woman has to listen to her doctor read a little paragraph describing her fetus's or her baby's development at that particular phase in the pregnancy, what the baby can or can't do or whatever. Or a woman has to, like an underage woman has to get her parents' permission to have the abortion. Or a woman has to get her husband's permission if she's married. Or they have to have a 24-hour waiting period. Like you can go in and get the abortion preparation stuff, but you have to go home for 24 hours and then come back to have the actual abortion the next day. Whatever. And so this all goes before the Supreme Court because all of those laws were pretty transparent. People understood that the point of the law was to try to convince women not to have abortions, like make fewer people have abortions. It goes back to the Supreme Court. Who's the justice now? 1992? Rehnquist. And we'll just finish up here. What Rehnquist says is this. Basically, they approve almost all of those limitations, so long, you need to write this part down, so long as they do not promote an undue burden. So like if I have to look and get a sonogram before I get an abortion, that's not really an undue burden. Just sit there and watch the sonogram and then get an abortion if that's what you want. So long as there's no undue burden, then any of those restrictions are going to be okay. The only one they struck down was spousal consent. You can't be required to have your husband's permission in order to get an abortion. You can require parents' permission. So anyway, no undue burden. That's Planned Parenthood's Casey. And we'll pick up then with, I don't remember what's next, on Tuesday. Then we'll review Thursday and the following Tuesday. And then 2 weeks from today, we will have the exam, your last exam.